plant. Yeah, it doesn't look so good, does it? We're moving into adult seminary. Grace to you all this morning. God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Yes, this is my office plant. It's looked worse than this, I have to tell you. I'm not much of a gardener. You go into Kathy's office, our office administrator, you go into her office, and you feel like you've walked into a rainforest. There's green stuff all over the place. She's got quite the green thumb. And I say, Kathy, if you wouldn't mind, could you just take a look at my plants every now and then? You can see how that's going. But you know what's really cool about this is that when I do water it, it just springs right back to life. What is this anyway? Sounds like a gardener, huh? It's a peace plant. P-E-A-C-E. Now I'm really embarrassed. I should be doing better with my peace plants than I am. I'm not much of a gardener. I mean, I enjoy gardening. Well, parts of gardening. You guys have a garden? Like planting stuff? I like parts of gardening. I like planting the seeds and watching them start to grow. And then the next part I like is harvesting whatever I've grown on those. It's the in-between part that kind of gets to be a little bit of a drag. The weeding and the pruning the plant back so that it produces the best kinds of things possible. That's a little bit of a challenge. And there have been occasions where my wife has said to me, why do you even bother putting in the garden? It's a good question. I guess the reason is because zucchini, if you don't plant anything else and you want to feel successful as a gardener, plant zucchini. This is true, right? You just leave them, and when the harvest time comes, you just go in there and move the weeds away, and there are zucchini in there. They're as big as your leg, right? Isn't that amazing? That's just incredible to me. You don't do anything to them, and you get zucchini that are huge. So those of you who are not gardeners and do not particularly enjoy being out in the soil, which may be true for many of you, probably all this talk of gardening just falls a little bit flat, no? And we've had a lot of talk about gardening in our readings for today, where Jesus uses two parables that refer to being farmers, and the psalm talks about being planted in God's house, and the lesson from Ezekiel is about horticulture and taking care of trees. And for most of us who don't really get into it that much, maybe it leaves you a little bit flat. Oh, here's my show and tell, by the way. I brought poppy seeds. I don't have any mustard seeds. Poppy seeds are good, though. Poppy seeds are tiny. Look at that. Look how tiny they are. You can't. See how small they are? Want to see how small poppy seeds are? You've probably seen them on your bagel, right? They're amazingly tiny. I guess mustard seeds are smaller than this. They're bigger than this? No, that's a tricky one. You've seen poppy seeds, right? You've seen them on your bagel. I wouldn't bother walking around with all the poppy seeds. More agricultural imagery. Jesus talks about a mustard seed, and poppy seeds are tinier. What are we doing with all that agricultural imagery? Mark tells us that Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables to the extent of their ability to hear. With many such parables, Jesus spoke to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables. Now, the reason Jesus used parables was because he wanted to give his hearers a point of contact or something that they could immediately identify with, and then in their own minds make the transition from that which they knew to that which they did not know but needed to know better. At least in Jesus' estimation of what his mission and ministry was. So Jesus wanted to take something very concrete, and since most of the time the people to whom he was speaking were agricultural people, they were farmers, they were people who made their living from the land, as for so much of human history most people did, Jesus told mostly agricultural parables that the people would immediately understand. He tells the parable, for instance, that first parable that we heard this morning about the man who sows the seeds and then he walks away, in a sense, walks away. See, I have biblical justification for the kind of gardening that I do. You walk away and then you come back when it's time for the harvest. Jesus said he walks away and then he comes back and look, there's this great crop. And he harvests that crop and it's like, wow, this is wonderful. And Jesus says, think about that as it happens. That's what the kingdom of God is like. Now, most of us are not farmers. In fact, I don't think any of us are farmers. Maybe you want to be a farmer later on in your life, but right now most of us are not farmers on that kind of a scale. So we hear this image of Jesus and we think, I know what it means from a distance, but not immediately. So that's not maybe the best parable for us because it doesn't have a point of contact with our lives. It's also the most popular image that Jesus uses for his teaching is an agricultural image. But secondly, the second most popular image that Jesus uses is the image of family. Very often when he's trying to communicate God the Father's relationship with us, and you saw it right there, he uses the image of a family relationship. For instance, later on in the gospel, he will say to those who are listening to him, which of you having a son, if your son asks for an egg, will give him a serpent instead? And most fathers can identify with that. Lo and behold, today is Father's Day. And we understand that good fathers are those who put the needs of their children before their own needs. As indeed any good parent will behave that way. Because they know that their children depend upon them. That because of the way we are created, we don't come into this world self-sufficient. But we need nurture and care so that we can grow to be mature adults. And that we can make our own contribution to the world. And that nurture and care takes, well, how long does it take? 12 years? More? Forever, a lifetime. Because you never stop caring for your children. And you always want to help them with your own guidance and advice, even when they don't want it anymore. That's part of being a parent. You continue to worry about them, and you want to kind of put the borders around them so that their path goes in the right direction. And perhaps the harshest learning as a parent is that there comes a day when, as much as you want to do that, your kids do one of two things. They say, I don't need that anymore. Or if they can't quite react that way, then what they do is they smack right into the borders. Right? They walk right over the boundaries. They're like, I know you don't want me to do this, but I'm going to assert my own independence, and I'm walking over those boundaries. And what you can do as a parent is just watch. Is that frustrating? Does that bring you to the edge of insanity? Absolutely. But that's what's necessary to allow our children to grow. Now, for the most part, the reason your parents establish those boundaries for you is because they love you and care about you. It may not feel like that. I understand. I had parents too. I still do. And guess what? Even though my parents are in their 80s, my mom still wants to set boundaries for me. I'll call her up and she'll say, how you doing? And I'll say, I'm good, I'm busy, but that's okay. It's all good stuff. She says, are you too busy? Are you taking care of yourself? Like I'm thinking, if I haven't got that down by 50, almost 55 years of age, Mom, your advice is coming too late. But as a mother, she just wants to make sure I'm doing okay. And she doesn't tell me what to do. She doesn't tell me, you know, you should take care of yourself. Are you eating your oatmeal in the morning? She just cares about me. And that's where your parents are coming from when they set those boundaries. Now, let's be clear about this. As parents, we're not always smart about the boundaries that we set. Sometimes we just get frightened and we pull those boundaries in really tight because we're worried and we react. But we still do it out of care and concern. Sometimes, as children, you're right to rebel. I know the parents are glaring at me now like, what are you saying? But it's true. Sometimes as children, you're right to rebel. In fact, every one of us has known that it was necessary for us to rebel against our parents in certain healthy ways so that we could become our own individual people. That's part of growing up and maturing. Now, if we can understand exactly what this is about from both points of view, as a child, which we all have been, but also from the point of view of parent, which many of us have been, then we too have our own entrance into Jesus' understanding of the kingdom. Jesus is speaking to us in a parable this morning when he talks about family. We understand that God's relationship to us is something like that. God sets boundaries for us, gives us a path in which we are open to walk. It's not a narrow path for us most of the time. It's a pretty wide and gracious and abundant path. And God says, this is the way that I'd like you to go. And if you walk in this way, your life will be well. And we think about that, and we walk that path for a while, but then we wonder what's on the other side of those boundaries. What's just around the corner? What about that little path that God hasn't told us about? In fact, what about those paths? And you probably all have this little temptation in your life. What about that path that says no trespassing? What about that path that says you shouldn't walk here? Don't do this. It was just last Sunday, right, that we heard the story about Adam and Eve in the garden. And God had given them this whole garden in which to live and said, eat of every single tree in the garden, this huge, abundant garden, except for the one. See, that was the tree with the fence around it, at least in their minds, and a little sign on it that says, don't eat this tree. And you know what happens as human beings. It's just our nature. It's our fallen human nature, we call it, that when somebody says don't do something, it's almost a sure way for us to want to investigate a little bit further. And we start to look into that little thing, and it's not so bad, and we seem to do okay. And whatever those scary pictures our parents told us about doing those things, or whatever God said about eating that tree, doesn't seem to come true, and so we go a little bit further until we're in too deep. God's relationship to us is that of a parent who wants to give us a path on which to walk, an abundant earth in which to live, a life for us to enjoy, and yet sometimes we want to explore what God hasn't told us about. And so we do, and end up in a place we would rather not be. Here too, God is like parent to us. Or maybe we put it the other way around and we say that the best parents are those who realize that their responsibility comes from God to nurture and raise God's children in ways that will make them healthy and strong and spiritually aware of God's presence. So when we walk that path that we ought not walk, do our parents walk away from us? God forbid. Have you guys ever done anything wrong? You don't have to be specific. I'm not asking you to tell me unless you really want to. We can turn this into a little prayer meeting here and have you express your sins, and then we'll wash you in the water and all will be good. No, but have you ever done anything wrong? You have, right? Have you ever done something your parents told you don't do that? And they kicked you out of the house, right? They said, don't you ever come in here again? I never want to see your face. That ever happened to you? Wait, you're thinking about that? Any of you homeless? Do you need a place to live? Apparently some of you have in fact been kicked out by your parents and you're no longer welcome at home, parents. Not true, right? Of course not true. I know it. But they get mad at you, right? Do you ever feel, I'm just talking from my own experience. I'm so glad. Thanks for having the bells ring today because I can just talk. I know from my own experience that sometimes you feel like you can't tell your parents what you did because they may kick you out. They may be so mad at you that they will just cut you off. But they won't do that. At least my parents never did. And I know yours won't because they love you that much. Now, it may feel like it, but we get over that, right? Your parents always provide a place for you to live and love for you. And that's a parable too. That's the way God treats us. We do things wrong, we trespass, we walk in places we ought not to walk, and God doesn't say, okay, that's it. Doors of the kingdom closed, you're finished, don't come home again, I've got no food for you, I've got no place for you, it's over. I think the worst experiences that we have as human beings is that when we think God is like the parent who will not welcome us home, and so we exclude ourselves from God's presence, whereas God's voice is constantly inviting us back into relationship with forgiveness and grace, and all we hear inside our own heads, all we feel inside our own selves is rejection and unworthiness, and so we will not allow ourselves to be available to that grace. We hear Paul speaking in the second letter to the Corinthians today. Twice in a few short verses he says, therefore we have confidence. And he's not talking about self-confidence. He's talking about confidence in God's grace. He says we're confident of that reality that supports and undergirds everything we do and whoever we are. We're confident that no matter what happens, God's grace has the last word. And I read those verses to myself about that kind of confidence, and I thought to myself, maybe Paul's got it, but not me all the time. Sometimes I lack confidence because I mistake confidence in God for self-confidence. And Paul wants us to keep those separate. Paul says you may doubt yourself. You may wonder about yourself. And he goes on to say, I wonder about myself, says Paul. I'm the chief of sinners. I'm the worst. There's us, right? That's me. I'm the worst sinner. But Paul says we have confidence in the grace of God to overcome our own shortcomings, our own sense of alienation, our own sense of separation, our own sense of unworthiness. And we understand, or at least Paul does, and wants us to as well, that God always leaves an open door and the light on, so that we might enter into that relationship again, forgiven and restored. That's good news, especially on this Father's Day. When we get to celebrate God as our Father, who always has a place for us, who never leaves or abandons us, who always cares for us, even when we feel that we don't deserve that love, that care, and that place. This is a parable, and its meaning is only discovered in the hearts of the faithful. Its meaning is only discovered as we open ourselves up to the truth that it offers to us. A parable is not a lecture. A parable is our story told from God's point of view. A parable reminds us, helps us to experience in an aha kind of way a deeper reality. In a real way, our time of worship together this morning, as we gather to pray and to receive the sacraments and to hear the word and to be uplifted by the music, in a real way, our gathering together this morning is a parable. We're invited to enter into the deeper meaning of this simple Sunday morning time of worship. We're invited to look behind the cover of what we do to see that God is intimately present to us. And like that parent who just wants their child to walk the right way, God has brought us together to instruct us, to uplift us, to bless us, to encourage us, to forgive us, to remind us of the omnipotence and omnipresence of grace. With many such parables, Jesus taught the people, and he did not teach them except in parables. I welcome you to this parable of worship, this experience of God's intimacy and presence, this knowledge of God as our loving Father who will not fail us, who invites us to receive forgiveness and grace, who opens us up again to walk that path that God has appointed for us to walk, who invites us to follow. For you see, sisters and brothers, the kingdom of heaven continues to grow in our midst, continues to infiltrate the world, and though it may seem small and insignificant at times, is the most powerful force in this universe of ours. And together, in this time of worship, we open ourselves to that growth and that redeeming presence. And we know that there's hope and a different future. For God continues to watch over and care for us and bring that new kingdom into reality. Amen.